Ethan knew something was off the moment he stepped into the stable that morning. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and leather, stronger than usual. His boots crunched against a layer of disturbed hay, and his eyes immediately scanned the area for any signs of trouble. Thunder, his prized stallion, stood in the corner, breathing heavily. His flanks were damp with dried sweat, which didn't make sense. The horses hadn't been ridden in 2 days, yet Thunder looked like he had just run a full sprint across the pasture. Ethan's stomach twisted as he noticed the hoof prints, muddy, overlapping, and far too many for just his horses. Someone had been here. Someone had taken his horses. His eyes snapped to the stable door, which was latched, but not the way he had left it. He always double-checked the latch, always. His first thought was kids messing around, maybe some local teens daring each other to sneak onto his land and play cowboy for a night. But the idea felt off. No kid would risk hopping the fence just for a few minutes of fun. Whoever did this knew horses. They hadn't just taken them out, they had ridden them hard. Ethan crouched, running his fingers through the churned-up dirt, and that's when he spotted something that made his jaw clench, a single delicate boot print, too small for a man, too neat for a kid. And right next to it, a strip of fabric snagged on the stall door, light pink, expensive. He grabbed it, his mind already spinning. He didn't know many women who rode in boots like these, but he knew one who would be bold enough to do something like this. Meredith. Meredith had been a thorn in his side since she moved in 6 months ago. She came with the Homeowners Association, HOA, like a storm cloud rolling in, bringing with her rules, complaints, and an obsessive need to control everything in sight. She hated his ranch, constantly nagging about fences, noise, and the smell of his horses. But stealing them? That was a whole new level of crazy. Ethan stormed out of the stable, his fist clenched, heart pounding. He needed proof. He needed to catch her in the act. The next morning, he set up a camera. Nothing fancy, just a motion-activated one hidden in the rafters of the stable. If someone came back, he'd know exactly who. And they did. The footage made his blood boil. Meredith and a group of her prissy friends, dressed like they were starring in some kind of low-budget Western film, sneaking into his stable like they owned the place. They laughed, saddled up his horses, and trotted around the property like it was their personal playground. One woman, a blonde wearing pearls and heels, tried to get on Thunder, only to slip and land straight into a pile of manure. The others shrieked with laughter, barely able to keep their balance as they rode in circles, tugging at the reins like clueless tourists. Ethan rewound the footage, his heart pounding. It wasn't just about them riding his horses, it was the way they did it. The way they yanked on the bits, the way they dug their heels in, the way Thunder flinched beneath their untrained hands. They had no idea what they were doing. They were hurting his animals. That was the last straw. The next evening, Ethan sat on his porch, arms crossed, waiting. He knew they'd come back, and this time, he'd be ready. Sure enough, right around midnight, he heard the unmistakable creak of the stable door, hushed voices, giggles, and the sound of boots on hay. Ethan moved fast. He stormed toward the stable, slamming the doors open so hard they rattled against the frame. The women shrieked. Meredith spun around, her eyes wide with shock, still holding a saddle in her manicured hand. Having fun. Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. Meredith recovered quickly, smoothing her hair like she hadn't just been caught committing trespassing. Ethan, there's no need for this hostility. We were just borrowing them. Borrowing, he snapped. You've been sneaking in here for God knows how long, yanking their reins, jerking them around like they're rental ponies. You could have seriously hurt them. One of the other women, the one who had fallen in the manure in the video, let out an awkward laugh. Oh, come on, Ethan. It's just a bit of fun. Fun. Ethan stepped closer, towering over them. Fun is calling the cops and letting them handle this because, last I checked, trespassing and theft aren't exactly neighborly behavior. Meredith's face paled. Now, wait a minute. Let's be reasonable. Ethan crossed his arms. You want reasonable? Fine. You're going to leave right now, and you're never coming near my horses again. You're going to tell the HOA to stay the hell off my property, and if I so much as see a footprint near my stable, I'll press charges so fast your fancy lawyer won't know what hit him. Meredith's jaw tightened, her fake politeness slipping away. You wouldn't dare. Try me. For a long moment, they just stood there, the other women shifting uncomfortably, clearly regretting their midnight adventure. Finally, Meredith huffed, tossing the saddle onto a nearby rack. Fine. But you're making a huge deal out of nothing, Ethan. We were just... Get out. He cut her off with a final glare. Meredith turned on her heel and marched out, her friends scrambling after her. Ethan watched them go, his pulse still hammering. He knew Meredith. She wasn't the type to back down easily, and he had a feeling this war was just getting started. Ethan barely got a full night's sleep before the fallout from his confrontation with Meredith started. The next morning, just as he was finishing up feeding Thunder and the rest of the horses, his phone buzzed. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and checked the screen. The message was from his neighbor, Sam. You're going to want to come to the HOA meeting today. Meredith's stirring up trouble. Ethan exhaled sharply. Of course, she was. She wasn't the type to take humiliation lightly. He wasn't even officially part of the HOA, his property was technically outside of their jurisdiction, but that had never stopped Meredith from trying to control everything within a mile of her house. He had half a mind to ignore it, but the thought of her twisting the situation to make herself the victim didn't sit right with him. So, after finishing his morning chores, he headed toward the community center, already preparing himself for whatever nonsense she had cooked up. When he walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward him. He immediately spotted Meredith at the front, sitting with her legs crossed, sipping from a coffee cup like she hadn't been sneaking into his stable just 2 nights ago. She barely spared him a glance before continuing her speech. And that is why it's important that we, as a community, ensure all properties adhere to the HOA's guidelines. Certain individuals are refusing to comply with reasonable requests for the betterment of our neighborhood. She smiled a saccharine, practiced smile. And unfortunately, it's causing distress among residents. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the back wall. He could already see where this was going. Another woman, one of Meredith's usual lapdogs, raised her hand. I completely agree. I mean, I hate to say it, but some areas are, well, they just don't fit the vision of our neighborhood. Meredith nodded. Exactly. Which is why I propose a motion to require all properties within a certain radius of the HOA to meet our standards. That includes fencing, noise control, and, of course, the upkeep of animals. Ethan let out a short laugh before he could stop himself. Heads turned toward him. Meredith feigned surprise, placing a hand on her chest. Oh, Ethan, she said sweetly. I didn't realize you were here. Yeah, I bet you didn't, he said. So, let me get this straight. You want me to follow HOA rules even though I'm not part of the HOA? Well, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. It's not just about you. It's about the community. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good. Sacrifices like what? Ethan asked, tilting his head. Letting you and your friends break into my stable and steal my horses? A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Meredith's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Oh, Ethan, she sighed, shaking her head as if he were a misbehaving child. No one stole anything. We were just borrowing. Sharing. We thought you wouldn't mind. I do mind, Ethan said flatly. And so does the law. Meredith's expression tightened for just a second before she replaced it with another condescending smile. There's no need to escalate things, she said. I'm sure we can work this out like adults. Oh, I'm being plenty adult about it, Ethan said. In fact, I've already spoken to the sheriff. He found it real interesting that a group of people were trespassing on private property and using animals without permission. Meredith's face finally lost some color. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and a few people exchanged nervous glances. Ethan pressed on. You don't like my horses? Fine. Stay the hell away from them. You don't like my ranch? Too bad. But don't think for a second you can walk onto my property like you own it and not deal with the consequences. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she wasn't completely in control of the situation. But she wasn't going to give up that easily. Well, she said, regaining her composure. If we're going to talk about consequences, let's talk about the disturbances your horses cause. They make noise at all hours, they attract flies, and frankly, they bring down the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. Ethan let out another laugh. Oh, so that's your plan? When stealing doesn't work, you're going to try and make my life miserable another way. Meredith shrugged. I'm simply advocating for the rules, Ethan. You, of all people, should understand that. Ethan could feel his patience wearing thin. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of a few other homeowners. Not all of them seemed on board with Meredith's plan. Some looked uncomfortable, others skeptical. He had an idea. "You know what?" he said. "Let's talk about rules. Because if we're going to be fair, we should all follow them, right?" Meredith's expression shifted slightly. "Of course." "Great," Ethan said. "Then let's make sure everyone here is up to code. Let's make sure every house follows zoning laws. Let's check property lines, financial records, noise complaints, and, oh, I don't know, trespassing reports." A few people immediately turned their heads toward Meredith. Her face remained neutral, but he could see the tension in her jaw. "Now hold on," she said. "There's no need to. I'm just saying," Ethan continued, his tone casual but firm. "If we're all about rules and fairness, let's make sure it applies to everyone. You included." The room fell silent. Meredith's face had gone stiff. She knew exactly what he was implying. If she kept pushing, she might just find herself on the receiving end of the very regulations she was trying to weaponize against him. Finally, she exhaled and plastered on another fake smile. "Well," she said, "perhaps we can revisit this discussion another time." "That's what I thought," Ethan said, pushing off the wall. "If you'll excuse me, I've got actual work to do." He turned and walked out, leaving the room buzzing behind him. He knew this wasn't over. Meredith wasn't the type to let things go. But for now, he'd made his point. By the time Ethan got back to his ranch, he already had a plan forming in his head. If Meredith wanted a war, she was going to get one. And this time, he wasn't going to just defend himself. He was going to make sure she regretted ever stepping foot in his stable. Ethan had barely stepped onto his porch the next morning when he saw the sheriff's car pulling up his driveway. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew this was coming. Meredith was nothing if not predictable. If she couldn't win through intimidation or manipulation, she'd try to drag him into a legal mess just to wear him down. The moment the car stopped, Sheriff Dawson stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked toward Ethan. "Morning, Ethan," Dawson said, tipping his hat. "Mind if we have a chat?" Ethan folded his arms, already feeling the tension in his shoulders. "Let me guess." Meredith called in a complaint. Dawson let out a tired chuckle. "You know it. She's claiming your horses are a nuisance and that you're creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood." Ethan scoffed. "A hostile environment? She and her goons broke into my stable and stole my horses." "I know," Dawson said, sighing. "We've got the footage, and trust me, she's in no position to be making demands. But you know how these HOA types are. They think rules apply to everyone but them." Ethan nodded, his mind already working. "So, what's next?" "Well," Dawson said, leaning against the railing. "Technically, we could press charges for trespassing and theft. But Meredith's got a lawyer already pushing back, saying it was a misunderstanding and that you had never explicitly told them they couldn't use the horses." He rolled his eyes. "It's a weak defense, but if she drags it out long enough, she might get a slap on the wrist at best." Ethan clenched his jaw. He hated the idea of Meredith walking away from this without real consequences. He knew she'd just find another way to cause trouble. He needed to hit her where it hurt, her ego. "All right," Ethan said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Then let's play by her rules." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "That grin tells me I should be concerned." Ethan waved a hand. "Just sit back and watch." The next morning, Ethan got to work. If Meredith wanted to play games with HOA rules, then he was going to give her a taste of her own medicine. First, he filed an official complaint against Meredith for breaking municipal laws, trespassing, theft, animal endangerment, everything he could legally throw at her. Then he reached out to a local news station. Nothing made HOA tyrants squirm like bad press. By noon, reporters were calling, eager to cover the story of a rogue HOA president caught stealing horses. He made sure to provide the security footage, which the news station loved. Within hours, the story started making the rounds, and the community was buzzing. Meredith, of course, was furious. She showed up at his ranch later that evening, practically vibrating with rage. "You set the media on me," she hissed, her face red as a fire hydrant. Ethan leaned against the fence, chewing on a piece of straw like he had all the time in the world. "Did I? Or did the media decide that entitled HOA president caught trespassing and horse riding without permission was just too juicy to ignore?" Meredith's hands balled into fists. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Ethan tilted his head. That's funny. I was about to say the same to you, Meredith. She seethed, but before she could spew whatever venom she had lined up next, a car pulled into the driveway. It was the sheriff again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Two uniformed deputies stepped out, one holding a clipboard. Meredith Walker, one of them asked. Meredith's face twitched. Yes, we have an official citation for trespassing and theft, the deputy said, handing her the paperwork. You're required to appear in court next month. Meredith snatched the papers, her lips pressed so tightly together they almost disappeared. This is harassment, she spat. Dawson just shrugged. No, ma'am. This is consequences. Meredith stormed off without another word, her heels clicking furiously against the gravel. Ethan watched her go, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. But he wasn't done yet. The next week, the HOA held another meeting, this time packed with residents who had caught wind of the scandal. Many of them weren't happy with Meredith. Turns out, she had been overstepping her authority for years, enforcing rules that weren't real, issuing fines that went straight into HOA projects no one had agreed to, and using her position to intimidate neighbors. Ethan sat in the back, arms crossed, as Meredith tried to salvage what little dignity she had left. This entire thing has been blown out of proportion, she insisted, forcing a smile. We should be focused on unity, not division. An older man in the front row stood up. Unity? You've been bullying half this neighborhood for months, and now you want unity? Another woman shook her head. We've had enough, Meredith. You can't just do whatever you want and expect us to fall in line. Meredith's face paled. Well, I motioned to remove Meredith as HOA president, a voice called from the back. Meredith turned sharply. Excuse me. Seconded, another voice joined in. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and within minutes, a vote was held. The results were clear. Meredith was out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching as she sputtered in disbelief. It was one thing to be fined, but being stripped of her precious title, that was a defeat she hadn't prepared for. By the time the meeting ended, Meredith had stormed out, her usual smugness gone. Ethan let out a breath and walked outside, feeling lighter than he had in months. But he wasn't finished yet. A week later, a brand new sign went up on Ethan's property. It was big, bold, and impossible to miss. Horseback riding lessons. HOA presidents get 50% off. It was petty. It was perfect. The first time Meredith saw it, she nearly swerved off the road. Ethan, standing by the fence, just tipped his hat and smiled. He knew she wouldn't be bothering him again anytime soon. The ranch returned to its peaceful state, and Ethan could finally focus on what he loved most, caring for his horses and living life on his own terms. Meredith, now stripped of her power and humiliated, kept her distance. The community, once divided, began to heal, and Ethan's ranch became a symbol of resilience and independence. As for Ethan, he had won more than just a battle. He had reclaimed his freedom and proved that no one could take away what was rightfully his. And as he watched Thunder gallop across the pasture, free and unburdened, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would always come out on top. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.